Stop crying. Pack your bags and leave. My daughter-in-law said it so casually, like she was asking me to pass the salt. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, sitting there at the dining table that had once held decades of birthdays, Christmas dinners, and quiet Sunday mornings. But the silence that followed told me I hadn't, because no one corrected her, no one flinched, and certainly no one defended me. Least of all my son's empty chair at the head of the table, still pulled out slightly, as if he might walk back in and fix everything the way he always used to. But Daniel wasn't coming back, not this time, not ever, and somehow, in the space left behind by his absence, everything had shifted just enough for the truth to slip through, sharp and cold and undeniable. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate, my hand steady in a way that surprised even me, because I had expected to feel something louder, something desperate. But what I felt instead was quiet, almost distant, like I was watching someone else's life unravel from across the room. Rachel didn't look at me when she said it again. Softer this time, but no less firm, as if repeating it made it more reasonable. You heard me, Margaret, it's time. And I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood something she didn't realize I understood yet. I stood up, pushed my chair in carefully, and walked upstairs without another word. The hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing faintly against the hardwood. Floors Daniel had insisted on installing himself 15 years ago. I passed the family photos lining the wall, stopping only for a second in front of one where he stood between us, smiling, his arm around my shoulders, hers around his waist, a perfect picture of a family that no longer existed. Inside my bedroom, the air still carried a trace of the lavender candle I had lit the night before the funeral. The suitcase sat at the foot of the bed where I had left it half-packed, unsure if I was preparing to leave or simply trying to feel in control of something. I added a few more things without thinking, a sweater, a pair of shoes, the small jewelry box Daniel had given me years ago. And then I closed it, not hurried, not hesitant, just done. Downstairs, I could hear Rachel moving around the kitchen, the faint clink of dishes, the low hum of the refrigerator, ordinary sounds that felt strangely out of place now, like they belonged to a different version of this house. A version where I still had a place. I didn't say goodbye when I walked out the front door, and no one stopped me. The evening air was cool, the sky just beginning to dim into that soft blue that always reminded me of early fall. I set my suitcase in the trunk of my car and paused for a moment, my hand resting on the metal, my reflection faint in the window, older than I remembered, but clearer somehow. And then I got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The next morning, I walked into the bank at exactly 9:02 a.m., the same branch Daniel had used for years, the same one where he had once told me, "Mom, if anything ever happens, you'll be taken care of." At the time, I had smiled and told him not to talk like that. But now, standing at the counter with the early sunlight cutting through the glass doors behind me, I realized he hadn't been speaking out of fear. He had been planning. And for the first time since Rachel told me to leave, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. I stood at the counter while the young teller smiled politely, her fingers moving across the keyboard as if this were just another routine morning. And perhaps to her it was, but to me, every second felt deliberate, measured, like each breath was part of a plan I had not realized I was following until now. I gave her my name, Margaret Collins, and for a brief moment I saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or simply the weight of a name that had been tied to this bank for her. Over 3 decades, she asked me to confirm my identification, and I did, calmly, the way I had always handled things in life, quietly, without drawing attention, without asking for sympathy, just doing what needed to be done. She nodded and clicked a few more keys, then paused, her eyes scanning the screen in front of her. And that was when I knew, before she even spoke, before she looked back at me with a slightly more careful expression, that Daniel had not left things to chance. "Mrs. Collins," she said gently, "there are several accounts here with your name listed as primary beneficiary." I did not react, not outwardly, but inside something settled into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding where it belonged. I asked her to show me everything, and she did. One document after another, statements, authorizations, quiet confirmations of decisions my son had made without ever burdening me with them. And as I read, I began to understand the shape of what he had built. Not just money, not just security, but a safeguard, something that existed outside the walls of that house Rachel thought she controlled, something she could not reach. The teller explained the details, but her voice faded into the background as my thoughts moved elsewhere, back to the dining room, to the way Rachel had not looked at me when she told me to leave, to the certainty in her voice, the confidence of someone who believed she already owned everything that mattered. I signed a few forms, transferred what needed to be transferred, and asked questions in a tone so steady it surprised even me. The kind of tone that does not invite interruption, the kind that makes people listen. When I was finished, I thanked the teller and stepped outside. The sunlight was brighter now, the morning fully awake, cars passing, people moving, life continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I sat in my car for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, not shaking, not uncertain, just still, and I thought about Daniel, about the way he used to watch people carefully before he trusted them, the way he always said that real intentions reveal themselves in silence, not in words, and I realized then that he had seen something I had not wanted to see, something he had prepared for in his own quiet way. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. Mr. Harrison, Daniel's attorney. I hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. The line rang twice before his voice answered. Older, but steady. Margaret, he said, as if he had been expecting me. And in that moment, I understood that this was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had already been set in motion long before Rachel ever told me to leave. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, I did not feel like someone who had lost everything. I felt like someone who had finally seen the truth clearly enough to act on it. I did not drive home after that call because there was no home waiting for me anymore, not in the way I used to understand it. Instead, I followed the directions Mr. Harrison gave me, turning onto a quiet street lined with tall oak trees, just beginning to lose their leaves, the kind of neighborhood where everything looked stable and well kept, where nothing seemed rushed or uncertain. His office sat in a modest brick building with a brass plaque by the door, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention, which felt appropriate. Daniel had always trusted people who did not need to prove their importance out loud. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, and for a brief moment, it reminded me of the study Daniel used to keep at the back of the house, organized, calm, controlled. Mr. Harrison stood up as soon as he saw me, his expression serious but not surprised. As if my arrival confirmed something he had been quietly expecting, he shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit, and I noticed how he did not begin with sympathy or empty words. He simply opened a folder and turned it toward me. Your son made very specific arrangements, he said, his voice even, measured, and he was clear about when I was allowed to discuss them with you. I looked down at the documents, pages filled with legal language that would have once overwhelmed me, but now felt almost reassuring in their precision. There were dates, signatures, contingencies, layers of protection built carefully over time. He updated everything about 6 months ago, Mr. Harrison continued. He wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, you would not be dependent on anyone else. I did not ask why Daniel had felt the need to do that. Not yet, because part of me already knew the answer was not something he had discovered overnight. It was something he had been watching, something he had been understanding piece by piece. Just as I was beginning to do now, Mr. Harrison pointed to a specific section, a clause that outlined ownership structures, beneficiary rights, and conditions that would only activate under certain circumstances. I read it slowly, once, then again, and each time it became clearer. Rachel did not own what she believed she owned. The house, the accounts, even certain personal assets were not as simple as they appeared. Daniel had separated them, protected them, ensured that control could shift if certain behaviors or decisions crossed a line he had quietly defined. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that realization settle. Not with anger, not with relief, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. Mr. Harrison watched me carefully, perhaps expecting a stronger reaction. But I simply nodded and asked him what steps needed to be taken next, because that was the only question that mattered now. He outlined the process, the timelines, the legal mechanisms that could be set in motion, and I listened, not interrupting, not rushing, just absorbing every detail. Outside the window, I could see the branches moving gently in the wind, steady, unhurried, and I realized that whatever Rachel believed she had secured the night she told me to leave, it was built on an assumption Daniel had already anticipated, an assumption he had already prepared to dismantle. And as I sat there in that quiet office, with the evidence of his foresight laid out in front of me, I understood something with absolute certainty. I had not been pushed out of my life. I had been moved into a position where I could finally see it clearly, and this time, I was not going to look away. When I stepped out of Mr. Harrison's office, the world felt quieter than it had that morning. Not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside me had settled in a place with a kind of stillness I had not felt in a long time. I walked slowly to my car, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with purpose. And as I opened the door and placed my purse on the passenger seat, my eyes caught a faint reflection of myself in the glass again. The same woman who had sat at that dining table the night before, but not quite the same, because now I could see what I had refused to see for years. I sat down and closed the door gently, resting my hands in my lap for a moment before starting the engine. And without thinking, my mind drifted back, not to the moment Rachel told me to leave, but to much earlier, to the first time I noticed something small, something easy to dismiss at the time. Rachel standing in the kitchen years ago, smiling too quickly when I walked in, her hand sliding away from a stack of papers on the counter, just organizing bills, she had said, her voice light, almost careless, and I had nodded, choosing not to question it, because that was what I had always done. I had chosen peace over curiosity, silence over discomfort, and I began to see how many moments like that I had overlooked, the way she gradually changed how things were done in the house, replacing routines Daniel and I had shared for years with new ones that somehow did not include me. The way conversations would stop when I enter a room, then resume with a different tone, softer, controlled, as if I were no longer part of what was being discussed at the time. I had told myself it was natural, that families evolve, that young couples need their space, but now, sitting alone in my car with the afternoon light stretching across the dashboard, I understood that it had never been about space, it had been about control. Daniel had seen it. I was certain of that now, the careful way. He used to watch her when she spoke about money. The way he would change the subject when she pushed too hard, the quiet conversations he and I had shared late at night in the living room, when he would sit across from me and say things that felt ordinary then, but carried a different weight now. Mom, if anything ever feels off, promise me you will not ignore it. And I had laughed it off, telling him I trusted his judgment, that everything was fine, but everything had not been fine, and he had known it long before I allowed myself to see it. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, not heading toward the house, not yet, because I knew walking back into that space without understanding my next move would only put me back where Rachel wanted me, uncertain, reactive, easy to dismiss. Instead, I drove slowly through the quiet streets, letting the rhythm of movement match the steady pace of my thoughts. I was not angry, not in the way I might have been years ago. What I felt was something colder, more precise, a clarity that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Rachel believed she had already won, that the moment I walked out that door with a suitcase was the end of my place in that family. But she had made one mistake. She had assumed that I would respond the way she expected, that I would either fight loudly or disappear quietly. And in doing so, she had overlooked the one thing Daniel had always counted on: patience. I turned onto a familiar road, slowing as I passed the entrance to the neighborhood, not turning in, just observing. The house stood there exactly as it always had, unchanged from the outside, as if nothing inside it had shifted, but I knew better now, and as I continued driving, leaving it behind once again, I realized that for the first time, I was not being pushed away from something I needed to hold on to. I was choosing when and how I would return, and this time, it would not be on anyone else's terms. I checked into a small hotel just off the highway that afternoon, the kind of place that did not ask questions and did not expect long stays. The carpet was a muted brown, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and the room held only what was necessary: a bed, a chair, a small desk by the window. It was not home, but it was quiet, and for now, quiet was exactly what I needed. I set my suitcase down near the wall and moved slowly through the room, placing my purse on the desk, setting my keys beside it, each movement deliberate, controlled. as if I were arranging more than just objects, as if I were putting my thoughts into order as well. I sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed the silence to settle around me. No footsteps upstairs, no distant sound of Rachel moving through the kitchen, no tension lingering in the air, just stillness. And in that stillness, I began to think not about what I had lost, but about what I had overlooked, because the truth was not something that had appeared overnight. It had been there, layered quietly beneath years of small decisions, small compromises, moments where I had chosen not to question, not to press, not to disrupt what I believed was harmony. I leaned back slightly and stared at the ceiling, letting the memories come without resisting them. The times Rachel had insisted on handling the household accounts, saying it would make things easier for everyone. The way Daniel had hesitated before agreeing, the brief look he had given me, as if asking a question he did not say out loud, and I had nodded, reassuring him without really understanding what I was agreeing to. I thought about the paperwork she had brought me months ago, documents she described as routine updates, insurance, maintenance, small administrative details that did not seem worth examining closely, and how quickly she had guided my hand to the signature line, how easily I had trusted her explanation, because at the time, it felt simpler to believe that everything was in order than to consider the possibility that it was not. I sat up slowly, that memory sharpening into something clearer now, something that no longer felt harmless. I reached for my purse and opened it, pulling out the small folder I had carried with me when I left the house. Inside were copies, not originals, but enough to remind me of what I had signed, the lines of text I had skimmed, the sections I had not fully read. I spread the papers out on the desk, smoothing them carefully, my eyes moving across the words with a different kind of attention now, not passive, not trusting, but focused, searching, and it did not take long before I noticed the inconsistencies, the phrasing that felt slightly off, the clauses that shifted responsibility in ways that no longer seemed accidental. I felt a slow, steady realization take hold, not panic, not fear, but certainty. This had not been random. It had been intentional, designed to look ordinary while quietly changing the structure beneath. Everything I believed was stable. I gathered the papers back together and placed them neatly in the folder, closing it with the same calm precision I had used to open it. Then I reached for my phone and looked at the time. It was early evening now, the sky outside the window beginning to darken, and I knew what I needed to do next, not tomorrow, not later, but soon. I picked up the phone and sent a message to Mr. Harrison, asking him to review every document I had signed in the past year, every transfer, every authorization, because if Rachel had assumed I would not look closely, then that was the assumption I intended to prove wrong. I set the phone down and stood up, walking over to the window. The parking lot below lit by a few scattered lights, cars coming and going without hesitation, and I watched them for a moment, not because they mattered, but because they reminded me that movement forward did not always require noise or urgency. Sometimes it required stillness first, understanding, and then action, measured, precise, undeniable. And as I stood there, looking out a place that was not mine, I realized that for the first time I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was preparing for what I was about to do next. Mr. Harrison replied sooner than I expected, his message brief but precise, asking me to come by first thing the next morning and to bring every document I had. I slept lightly that night, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was moving through details with a kind of quiet efficiency, organizing what I knew, what I suspected, and what still needed to be confirmed. When I arrived at his office just after 9, the same calm stillness greeted me. But this time I felt more aligned with it, as if I belonged in that space of careful thought and deliberate action. I placed the folder on his desk, and he began reviewing each page without rushing, his eyes scanning line by line, occasionally pausing, occasionally making a small note in the margin. I watched him without speaking, learning from the way he approached the information, not emotionally, not reactively, but methodically, as if the truth was something that revealed itself only to those willing to look closely enough. After several minutes, he leaned back slightly and removed his glasses, setting them down with a quiet certainty that told me he had found what he needed. These were not routine documents, he said, his voice steady. They were structured to transfer partial control over specific assets under conditions that were not clearly disclosed. I nodded once, not surprised, because the feeling I had the night before had already prepared me for this, but hearing it confirmed shifted something from intuition into fact, and facts, I was beginning to understand, were far more powerful than emotions in situations like this. He continued explaining, pointing out sections where language had been intentionally vague, where responsibilities had been redefined in ways that would only become visible over time. And as he spoke, I could see the pattern forming clearly. This had not been a single decision or a single moment of deception. It had been a series of small, calculated steps, each one designed to seem insignificant on its own, but together creating a structure that favored Rachel in ways I had never agreed to. However, he added, turning one of the pages toward me, there are protections in place that override these documents under specific circumstances. I recognized the clause immediately, the same one he had shown me the day before, the one Daniel had insisted on including, a condition that allowed for a complete reversal if any form of coercion or misrepresentation could be demonstrated. I looked at Mr. Harrison and asked the only question that mattered. What would be required to activate that protection? He did not hesitate. He outlined the steps clearly: documentation, verification, a formal review process that would examine the validity of each signed agreement. And as he spoke, I realized something important. Rachel had assumed that the papers themselves were enough, that once signed, they would stand without question, but she had underestimated the existence of safeguards she did not know about, safeguards Daniel had put in place quietly. Without confrontation, without announcement, I gathered the papers back into the folder, my movements calm, controlled, and I asked Mr. Harrison to begin the process immediately, not aggressively, not publicly, but precisely. He nodded, already preparing the necessary filings, and as I stood to leave, he paused for a moment, looking at me with a level of respect that had not been there before, not because I had changed, but because I was no longer presenting myself as someone who needed protection. I was someone who understood what needed to be done. Outside, the morning air felt crisp, clear, and as I walked to my car, I realized that everything Rachel had set in motion depended on one assumption: that I would remain unaware, that I would accept what was happening without question. And now that that assumption was gone, everything she believed she controlled had begun to shift, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that could not be undone once it had started. 3 days passed without a single word from Rachel, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because she had always been the kind of person who filled space with control, with instructions, with carefully chosen words that shaped how others responded to her. But now there was nothing, no calls, no messages, not even a polite attempt to ask where I had gone, and that absence was not indifference, it was calculation. I recognized it now, the same way I had begun to recognize so many other patterns I had once ignored. She was waiting for me to act in a way she could predict, to reach out, to ask questions, to show uncertainty, but I did none of those things. Instead, I followed the process Mr. Harrison had set in motion, quietly gathering what was needed: records, timelines, copies of communications that seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried a different weight when placed in the right context. I spent hours going through old emails, bank statements, even small notes I had kept without thinking they would ever matter. And with each piece, the structure became clearer, not chaotic, not emotional, but deliberate. Rachel had not made mistakes. She had made choices, consistent, intentional choices that all pointed in the same direction: control over assets, over decisions, over the narrative of what belonged to whom. And as I reviewed everything, I noticed something else, something that had not stood out before: the timing. Certain documents had been introduced when Daniel was traveling, others when he was occupied with work, moments when I was more likely to rely on her explanation rather than question the details. It was not rushed, it was paced, designed to feel natural, and for years it had worked. I sat at the small desk in the hotel room, the lamp casting a soft light over the papers spread out in front of me, and I realized that this was not just about correcting what had been done, it was about understanding it fully, because once I understood it, I could respond in a way that could not be undone. My phone remained silent on the table beside me, and I let it stay that way because I knew that when Rachel finally did reach out, it would not be out of concern, it would be out of necessity. Something would shift, something she expected to remain stable would begin to move, and that would be the moment she would try to regain control. I was not going to give her that opportunity unprepared. Later that evening, Mr. Harrison called to confirm that the initial review process had been filed. His tone calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent of momentum in his words, as if something had already begun turning beneath the surface. "It will take a few days for everything to be formally acknowledged," he said, "but once it is, there will be questions raised about the validity of those documents." I thanked him and ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk, and I allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not to rest, but to observe the shift that was already happening, because even though nothing had changed outwardly yet, I could feel it. The balance that Rachel believed she controlled was no longer steady. It was beginning to tilt slowly, quietly, in a way that could not be corrected by words or appearances. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the same parking lot, the same steady flow of movement. And I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about timing, about allowing the truth to surface in a way that left no room for denial. And when that moment came, I would not need to raise my voice or defend myself, because everything that needed to be said would already be written in the facts she could not escape. On the fourth morning, my phone rang just as the first light was settling across the room, and I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was, because timing had always been Rachel's most predictable habit. She did not act out of emotion. She acted when something shifted beyond her control. I let it ring twice before answering, not to delay, but to remind myself that I was no longer responding on instinct. "Margaret," she said, her voice measured, carefully neutral, as if we were discussing something routine, "I think we need to talk." I stood by the window, looking out at the same quiet parking lot, and I could almost picture her standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, posture straight, expression composed, already rehearsing the direction she wanted the conversation to take. "About what?" I asked, my tone even, without invitation, without resistance. Just a question placed exactly where it needed to be. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not long enough for most people to notice, but long enough for me to understand that she had expected something else, perhaps defensiveness, perhaps hesitation, but not this. "There are some issues with the accounts," she said finally, "and some paperwork that needs clarification." I did not respond immediately. I let her words settle. Not because I needed time to think, but because silence had become something different now. It was no longer uncertainty, it was space. And in that space, she had to decide how to proceed without knowing what I already knew. "I see," I said, nothing more, and that seemed to shift something in her tone, a slight tightening, a careful adjustment. "It would be better if we handled this together," she continued, "in person." I could hear the intention beneath the words, not collaboration, not concern, but control. She wanted to bring the situation back into an environment she understood, one where she could guide the conversation, shape the narrative, and limit what I might say or do. I turned slightly, resting my hand against the window frame, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers, grounding, steady. "I will let you know when I am available," I said, and this time the silence that followed was hers, longer, heavier, because I had just done something she had not accounted for. I had not refused, but I had not agreed either. I had removed the timeline from her hands. "Margaret," she said again, a subtle edge now present in her voice. "This is important." I allowed myself a small, quiet breath before answering, not to calm myself, but to choose my words with precision. "I am aware," I said, and then I ended the call, not abruptly, not rudely, but definitively. I set the phone down on the desk and remained still for a moment, not reacting, not analyzing, just acknowledging what had just happened, because that call had not been about information, it had been about position. And for the first time, I was no longer standing where she expected me to be. I moved back to the desk and looked at the documents spread out before me. The evidence of everything that had been done quietly, carefully, over time, and I understood that Rachel's call meant the process Mr. Harrison had initiated was already creating pressure. Questions were being raised, inconsistencies noticed, and she had felt it, even if she did not yet understand the full extent of what was unfolding. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning the edges with deliberate care, and placed them back into the folder. Because this was no longer about discovering the truth, it was about allowing it to surface at the right moment, on the Right terms? I picked up my phone again and sent a brief message to Mr. Harrison, informing him of the call, and his response came quickly, confirming what I had already suspected. The review had triggered a formal inquiry into several transactions, and that inquiry would require Rachel to provide explanations she might not be prepared to give. I set the phone down once more and walked to the window, the morning now fully awake. The light stronger, clearer, and I realized that what had once felt like an ending had quietly become something else entirely. Not a return to what I had lost, but a movement towards something Rachel could not control. And this time, I was not waiting for her next move. I was watching as the space around her began to close in ways she had never anticipated. That afternoon, I drove back toward the house for the first time since I had left, not to return, but to observe, because there's a difference between going back and stepping into a situation with intention. I slowed as I turned onto the street, the familiar line of houses unchanged, the same trimmed hedges, the same quiet stillness that had always made it feel like nothing disruptive could ever happen there. And yet I knew better now. I parked a short distance away, not directly in front, and remained inside the car, watching, not with emotion, but with attention. The front door was closed, the curtains drawn slightly, and for a moment, everything appeared exactly as it always had, but appearances, I had learned, were often the least reliable part of any situation. I noticed a car I did not recognize parked in the driveway, a dark sedan, clean, understated, the kind of vehicle that suggested purpose rather than presence. And I understood immediately the inquiry Mr. Harrison had mentioned was no longer theoretical. It had begun to take form. I sat there quietly, my hands resting on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just steady. As I watched the front door open, Rachel stepped outside, her posture controlled, her expression composed in the way she had perfected over the years. But there was something different now, something subtle but unmistakable, a tightness in the way she held her shoulders. A slight pause before she spoke to the man who followed her out, dressed in a suit, holding a folder similar to the ones I'd been reviewing. They exchanged a few words I could not hear, but I did not need to, because I recognized the rhythm of it, the careful explanations, the attempt to guide the conversation without appearing to do so. And for the first time, I saw it from the outside, not as someone being influenced, but as someone observing the method itself. The man listened, nodded, then spoke again, his tone measured, professional, and whatever he said caused Rachel's expression to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough for me to see the moment where control slipped slightly out of her grasp. She gestured toward the house, inviting him back inside. And as they disappeared through the doorway, I allowed myself a slow breath, not out of relief, but acknowledgement. This was the beginning of something she could not manage the way she had managed everything else. I remained in the car for several more minutes, not rushing, not reacting, simply letting the reality of what I was seeing settle into place, because this was no longer about what I suspected or what I had been told. It was happening quietly, officially, in a way that would leave a record, that would require answers, that would not be resolved through persuasion or control. Eventually, I started the engine again, pulling away from the curb with the same calm precision I had carried through every step so far. I did not look back in a mirror, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I no longer needed to confirm what I already understood. As I drove away, I thought about the difference between the woman who had sat at that dining table and the one who was now leaving that street behind her. And the difference was not strength. It was clarity I was no longer trying to hold on to, something that had already been taken from me. I was allowing the truth to move forward on its own. And in doing so, I'd stepped out of the role Rachel had expected me to play. I returned to the hotel as the afternoon light began to fade, the room exactly as I'd left it, still quiet, unchanged, and I placed my keys on the desk, setting them down with a sense of finality that did not come from loss, but from understanding, because for the first time, I could see the full shape of what had been done, and more importantly, I could see how it was beginning to come undone, not through confrontation, not through force, but through the simple act of being brought into the light where it could no longer remain hidden. The next morning began without urgency, but not without direction. I woke before the alarm, the room still dim with early light filtering through the curtains, and for a moment I remained still, not out of hesitation, but because I had learned the value of beginning the day without rushing into it. I sat up slowly, placed my feet on the floor, and allowed my thoughts to settle in a place, not scattered, not reactive, but aligned with what I already knew needed to happen. My phone rested on the desk where I had left it, silent, but I understood that silence differently now. It was no longer empty. It was active, filled with processes unfolding beyond what could be seen in a single moment. I dressed carefully, choosing simplicity over anything else, because nothing about this required display, only clarity. And as I prepared to leave, my phone lit up with a message from Mr. Harrison, brief and precise as always, confirming that a formal request for documentation had been issued and that Rachel would be required to respond within a defined time frame. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because I recognized the significance of what had just been set in motion. This was no longer a quiet review. It was a structured demand for explanation, one that could not be ignored or redirected. I placed the phone back on the desk and picked up my keys, the metal cool in my hand, grounding, familiar, and I stepped outside into the morning air, crisp and clear, the kind of day that carried a sense of forward movement without needing to announce it. I drove without turning on a radio, without filling the space with noise, because I wanted to remain aware not just of where I was going, but of how everything was unfolding around me. I stopped briefly at a small cafe, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching people move through their routines, conversations, errands, ordinary life continuing without interruption, and I realized how easily something significant could unfold beneath the surface of what appeared completely normal. I took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth steady, grounding, and I thought about Rachel, about the position she now found herself in. Not because I felt anything toward her, but because understanding her situation allowed me to anticipate what would come next. She would not respond immediately. She would review, assess, attempt to find a way to maintain control, to reframe the situation in a way that preserved her position. But what she was facing now was not something that could be managed through presentation. It required answers, documentation, consistency, and those were things she could not adjust once they had been recorded. I finished my coffee and left the cafe, returning to the car with the same calm precision that had guided every step so far. As I drove, my phone rang again, and this time I glanced at the screen before answering. It was Rachel, of course, her timing aligning with exactly what I had expected. I let it ring once, then answered, not to engage, but to observe. "Margaret," she said, her voice composed, but the control I had once heard so clearly in it was now layered with something else, something more careful. "I received some inquiries this morning, and I believe there has been a misunderstanding." I listened without interrupting, allowing her to speak, to choose her words, to reveal the approach she was taking, because in that moment, every word mattered more than any argument could. "We need to resolve this quickly," she continued, "before it becomes unnecessarily complicated." I paused for a brief moment before responding, not to think, but to place my words exactly where they needed to be. "Then I suggest you provide exactly what has been requested," I said, my tone even, without emphasis, without challenge. Just a statement that left no space for interpretation. There was silence on the other end. Longer this time, heavier, because what I had said removed the possibility of negotiation, of redirection, of control. It placed the responsibility entirely where it belonged. And after a moment, she responded, but her voice had shifted, the certainty no longer absolute. "We will discuss this further," she said. And then the line went quiet. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the seat beside me, my eyes returning to the road ahead, steady, clear, and I understood something with complete certainty. The structure Rachel had built depended on control over perception, over timing, over response, but now she was operating within a framework she did not control, one that required consistency, accuracy, and transparency, and in that framework, everything she had carefully arranged was beginning to unravel. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that could not be stopped once it had begun. The meeting was scheduled for late morning. Not at the house, not in any place Rachel could control, But in Mr. Harrison's office, a neutral space where every word carried weight and every silence meant something, I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, but because I prefer to enter a situation before it fully formed, to observe it as it settled rather than stepping into it already in motion. I took a seat near the window, the same chair I had sat in days before, and placed my hands calmly in my lap, not clasped, not tense, just still. When Rachel walked in, she paused for a fraction of a second upon seeing me. A hesitation so brief most people would have missed it, but I did not. Her posture adjusted immediately after, shoulders back, expression composed, the version of herself she presented when she needed to. Regain control. She greeted Mr. Harrison first, her tone polite, measured, then turned to me with a small, controlled smile. "Margaret," she said, as if we were meeting under ordinary circumstances. I nodded once, acknowledging her presence without engaging further, because this was not a conversation to be shaped by familiarity or emotion. We sat across from each other, the desk between us holding the documents that had brought us here. Mr. Harrison began without delay, outlining the purpose of the meeting, the inquiries that had been raised, and the need for clarification regarding specific transactions and signed agreements. His voice remained steady, neutral, but precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Rachel listened, her expression unchanged, but I could see the calculations behind her eyes, the way she was aligning her responses before speaking. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table. "There has been some confusion," she said, her tone calm, practiced. Margaret was fully aware of these documents and their purpose. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I simply allowed the statement to exist in the room, because I understood now that truth did not need to be defended immediately. It needed to be placed correctly. Mr. Harrison turned to me, not with urgency, but with acknowledgement, and I spoke only when it was necessary. I signed documents that were presented as routine administrative updates. I said, my voice even, each word deliberate. I was not informed of any transfer of control or conditional clauses tied to those signatures. The room remained quiet for a moment, not tense, but focused, because what had just been said was not emotional. It was factual, and facts required response. Rachel's expression shifted slightly, not enough to break her composure, but enough to show that the direction of the conversation was no longer fully hers to guide. "That is not accurate," she replied, her tone still controlled, but more careful now. Everything was explained at the time. Mr. Harrison did not react to either statement immediately. Instead, he reached for a document, sliding it across the desk with a calm precision that mirrored the process itself. "Then we will need to review the context in which these signatures were obtained," he said, his voice steady, "as well as the disclosures provided at that time." Rachel's hand rested near the edge of the table, still, composed, but I noticed the slight tightening of her fingers against the surface, a small detail, but one that revealed more than any raised voice could. Because this was no longer about what could be said convincingly. It was about what could be supported consistently. The meeting continued in this measured way, each question building upon the last, each response narrowing the space in which interpretation could exist. And I remained exactly as I had chosen to be from the beginning, present, attentive, but not reactive, because this was not a moment that required force. It required clarity, and as the conversation unfolded, I realized that the outcome was no longer something that needed to be fought for. It was something that was already forming, shaped by the very structure Rachel had believed would protect her, but which now required her to provide answers she could not adjust once spoken. When the meeting ended, no conclusions were announced, no decisions declared, but that was not where the significance lay. It was in what had been established, the questions that had been placed on record, the inconsistencies that had been noted. And as Rachel stood to leave, offering a brief, controlled nod, I did the same, not as acknowledgement of her, but as recognition of the moment itself, because for the first time, everything that had once been hidden within quiet assumptions was now being examined in the open, and that was something no amount of control could undo. The days that followed did not bring sudden change, but they carried something far more significant, a steady progression that could not be reversed once it had begun. I returned to the hotel that afternoon after the meeting and placed my things exactly where they had been before. The room unchanged, the quiet still intact, but the weight of what had been set in motion now felt different. Not uncertain, not suspended, but moving forward with a kind of inevitability that did not require attention to continue. I sat at the desk and allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what had been said, but on what had been established, because the difference between those two things was where everything mattered. Rachel had spoken carefully, deliberately, but her words had not erased the questions that now existed formally, on record, questions that require consistency across every document, every timeline, every explanation she would provide, and consistency was something that could not be adjusted once the structure began to tighten around it. My phone remained still for most of the evening, and I did not expect otherwise because I understood now that this was the stage where she would be reviewing, recalculating, attempting to align what had been done with what could still be presented as acceptable. But what she faced now was not a matter of presentation. It was a matter of alignment, and alignment required precision she no longer controlled. The following morning, I received a call from Mr. Harrison, his tone unchanged, steady, but there was a clarity in his words that confirmed what I had already begun to sense. The review has identified several discrepancies that require formal correction, he said, and based on the structure your son put in place, those corrections will shift control back to you. I listened without interruption, not because I was unaffected, but because I had reached a point where reactions no longer served a purpose. Understanding did. He continued outlining the next steps, the adjustments that would be made, the formal notifications that would follow. And as he spoke, I realized that what had once seemed like something I needed to fight for had already been secured long before I knew it was necessary. Daniel had not left anything unfinished. He had simply left it for the right moment to unfold. I thanked Mr. Harrison and ended the call, placing the phone down gently, not with relief, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement, because this was not about winning. It was about truth settling in a place where it could no longer be shifted. Later that afternoon, another message arrived, this time not from Mr. Harrison, but from Rachel, brief, controlled. "We need to discuss the next steps," she wrote, and I read it once, then set the phone aside without responding immediately, because for the first time, urgency was no longer mine to carry. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the same view I had seen for days, but now it felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because my position within it had. I was no longer outside of what had been built, trying to understand it from a distance. I was within it now, where everything that had been hidden was being brought into alignment. I picked up my phone and replied with a single sentence, clear, measured. All communication should go through Mr. Harrison. And after sending it, I set the phone down again, not waiting, not watching for a response, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to manage through conversation. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion, and as I stood there, in a place that had never been meant to be permanent, I understood something with complete certainty. What Rachel had believed was the end of my place in that house had quietly become the beginning of something she could not control. And this time, there would be no need for confrontation, no need for explanation, because everything that mattered was already being decided in a way that could not be undone once it was complete. The final notification came on a quiet afternoon, not with urgency, not with any dramatic interruption, but with the same steady tone that had carried through every step of this process. I was sitting by the window in the hotel room, the lights softer now, the day moving toward evening, when my phone rang and I saw Mr. Harrison's name on the screen. I answered calmly, already understanding that whatever he was about to say would not be unexpected. "It is complete," he said, his voice measured, but with a finality that did not need emphasis. "The corrections have been filed and recognized. Control has been formally restored according to the provisions your son established." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of relief, not out of emotion, but simply to acknowledge the weight of what had just settled into place, because this was not a sudden victory. It was the conclusion of something that had been carefully built long before I ever stepped into that bank, long before Rachel believed she had secured her position. I thanked him, not with excess, just with quiet certainty, and ended the call, placing the phone down beside me. The room unchanged, the silence the same, but everything within that silence now different. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar view one last time, the parking lot, the steady movement of cars, people passing without awareness of what had just shifted. And I realized that this place had never been where the change happened. It had only been where I came to see it clearly later that evening. I drove back to the house, not to reclaim it, not to confront anyone, but because there was something I needed to complete. The street was as quiet as it had always been, the house standing unchanged from the outside, but I knew now that what it represented had already shifted entirely. I parked in the driveway this time, not down the street, and stepped out of the car with the same calm precision that had carried me through everything else. When I walked to the front door, it opened before I could reach for the handle. Rachel stood there, her posture still composed, but the certainty that had once defined her was no longer as solid. There was something else now, something more restrained, more aware. We stood facing each other for a moment. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a quiet understanding of everything that had unfolded. "Margaret," she said, her voice controlled, but without the authority it once held. I did not respond immediately, not because I needed time, but because I no longer felt the need to fill silence with words. I stepped inside, the air of the house familiar, unchanged in scent, in structure, in the way light fell across the floor, but entirely different in meaning. I walked past her without hesitation, setting my keys on the same table they had rested on for years, not as a claim, not as a statement, but as a simple action that required no explanation. She did not stop me, did not speak again, because there was nothing left to direct, nothing left to control. I turned to face her then, not with anger, not with judgment, just with clarity. "This was never yours to give or take," I said, my voice steady, quiet, final. And I saw the understanding settle in her expression, not dramatic, not immediate, but certain, because the truth, once it is fully seen, does not need to be argued. I did not wait for a response. I did not remain to explain anything further. I picked up my keys again and walked back toward the door, leaving the house not as someone who had been forced out, but as someone who had already moved beyond it. And as I stepped outside into the fading light, I understood that what had been taken from me was never truly lost. It had simply been hidden behind assumptions I had chosen not to question. And now that those assumptions were gone, there was nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to prove, only the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where I stood and the freedom that came with no longer needing anyone else to define it.